65 minutes, they would kill each other until one side had nothing left.
There are no British soldiers in this story. Let that settle for a moment, because it is the thing about the Battle of King's Mountain that stops most people cold the first time they hear it. No British regulars, no redcoats marching in formation, no professional imperial infantry executing the tactics of a professional army. Every single man who fought at King's Mountain on October 7th, 1780, every man on both sides, the attackers and the defenders, the living and the dying, was an American. They spoke the same language. They'd grown up in the same backcountry. Many of them had gone to the same churches, drunk at the same taverns, attended the same county musters in the years before the war. Some of them were cousins, some had been neighbours, some had done business together, shared harvests, helped each other build barns in the decades before politics and war tore the world they knew into two irreconcilable halves. And on that October afternoon in the Carolina backcountry, they climbed a rocky forested ridge and killed each other with a ferocity and a determination that shocked even the hardened veterans of the Revolutionary War who heard about it afterward. This is the story of King's Mountain, and it begins, as the most important stories always do, not at the moment of the battle itself, but weeks and months earlier, in the larger catastrophe that made the battle both necessary and inevitable. By the autumn of 1780, the American Revolution in the South was not going badly. It had gone catastrophically. The fall of Charleston in May had been the single largest American military defeat of the entire war. 5,000 soldiers surrendering in one terrible morning, the Continental Army in the South effectively ceasing to exist. Then Camden in August had destroyed what little remained of organised American military resistance, routing Gates's replacement army so completely that the so-called hero of Saratoga had fled the battlefield on horseback and kept riding for 60 miles before he stopped. The British now held the major towns, the coastal cities, the river crossings, the roads. They had established a chain of fortified posts stretching from the coast deep into the backcountry interior. Lord Cornwallis, commanding British forces in the south, believed with genuine confidence that the Carolinas were pacified, that the rebellion there had been broken, and that the only remaining task was to consolidate control, rally the substantial Loyalist population to the Crown's support, and use the South as a base for pushing northward into Virginia. He was, in the autumn of 1780, very close to being right. What he had not fully accounted for was the backcountry. Not the backcountry as a geographic feature, but the backcountry as a culture, a particular kind of people, Scots, Irish, and German and English settlers who had carved their lives out of the Carolina and Virginia and Georgia wilderness with their own hands over the previous 2 generations, who were fiercely independent, ferociously proud, deeply resistant to any external authority that had not earned their respect, and who had a particular relationship to violence that made them formidable in a way that professional military thinkers of the 18th century did not always know how to account for. These were people who hunted for their food, who fought the frontier conditions of their environment as a matter of daily survival, who settled personal disputes with a directness that European civilization had long since refined out of its professional soldiers. They were not fighting for abstract principles of liberty or constitutional theory, though some of them certainly believed in those things. They were fighting because someone had threatened their homes, their families, their land, and their way of life. And that kind of motivation does not break under the weight of battlefield reverses the way the motivation of a conscripted professional soldier sometimes does. The man Cornwallis sent to pacify the backcountry and bring these people to heel was Major Patrick Ferguson of the 71st Highlanders, one of the most gifted and innovative military officers in the entire British Army. Ferguson was brilliant, inventive, personally courageous, and by the standards of his era, genuinely humane. He was famous for refusing to shoot a mounted American officer in the back during the Battle of Brandywine, the kind of chivalric restraint that made him admired even by his enemies. He had invented and personally manufactured an improved breech-loading rifle that was decades ahead of its time. a weapon of extraordinary accuracy and rate of fire that could have changed the course of the war if the British Army had adopted it in any numbers. He was charismatic, energetic, and possessed of the kind of natural authority that drew men to follow him without needing to be coerced. He was also, in October of 1780, about to make a mistake so catastrophic that it would undo much of what the British had accomplished in the South in a single afternoon. The mistake had begun weeks earlier, with a message. Ferguson had been ranging through the Carolina backcountry at the head of a mobile force of Loyalist militia, recruiting, organising, drilling, and when necessary suppressing Patriot activity with the ruthless efficiency that Cornwallis required of his backcountry commanders. He had been largely successful. The Loyalist population of the Carolinas was real and substantial, and Ferguson was the kind of leader who inspired genuine loyalty rather than mere compliance. His force had grown to over 1,000 men, Carolina and Georgia Loyalists, many of them experienced fighters, all of them motivated by their own version of the same mix of principle, community loyalty, and personal interest that drove the men on the Patriot side. In late September of 1780, word reached Ferguson that groups of Patriot militia from beyond the mountains, from what is now Tennessee and Virginia, from the communities over the Appalachian ridgeline, were organising to come after him. The Overmountain Men, they would be called, a term that captured something real about their identity. These were people who had gone beyond the settled frontier, who had pushed past the mountains that bounded the coastal world, who had built their communities in the valleys of the Watauga and Nolichucky rivers in territory that barely existed on official maps. They were, in the most literal sense, beyond the British sphere of organised authority. Ferguson's response to the news of their organising was the message, and the message was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential pieces of military arrogance in the history of the Revolutionary War. He sent word over the mountains to the Patriot settlements, delivered by a paroled prisoner named Samuel Phillips, threatening the over-mountain communities directly. He would march his army over the mountains, Ferguson warned, lay waste to their country, hang their leaders, and put everything to fire and sword if they did not desist from their opposition to the crown. It was meant to be intimidating. It was, instead, like striking a hornet's nest with a stick. The men over the mountains did not respond to threats the way Ferguson expected. They responded the way their culture had always taught them to respond, by getting their guns and coming to find the man who had made the threat. The message, rather than suppressing backcountry resistance, galvanized it. Within days of its delivery, militia colonels from across the mountain communities were meeting to plan a response. Isaac Shelby of Sullivan County, John Sevier of Washington County, William Campbell of Virginia, Charles McDowell of Burke County, Arthur Campbell of Virginia, Benjamin Cleveland of Wilkes County. These were not professional soldiers. They were frontier community leaders, men who held their positions because their neighbours trusted and respected them, because they had proven themselves capable in the harsh conditions of backcountry life, because they could lead by example rather than by rank. They were colonels in the way that backcountry life produced colonels, through demonstrated competence rather than social position. They gathered their men with remarkable speed. In the last days of September 1780, the Overmountain Men assembled at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River, approximately 1,000 men with their rifles, their horses, their own provisions, and a collective determination that the accounts of the time describe as something close to religious in its intensity. The Reverend Samuel Doak preached to the assembled men before they departed, and the sermon he delivered was not a gentle prayer for safety and success. It was a call to righteous war, drawing on the Old Testament imagery that the Scots-Irish Presbyterian tradition kept close to hand. Gideon and the Midianites, the sword of the Lord, the defence of the chosen people against those who would destroy them. The men who rode out from Sycamore Shoals did so in the absolute conviction that what they were doing was not merely politically justified, but morally necessary. They crossed the mountains in conditions that would deter most modern hikers, even with proper equipment. Snow on the high passes, cold that cut through their clothing. The narrow trails of the mountain ridges that they travelled not for a day but for multiple days. Following the geography of the Appalachians southeastward into Carolina territory where Ferguson's force was ranging, they picked up additional men as they rode, militia units from the Carolina Piedmont who had been waiting for exactly this kind of organised movement, who joined the column and swelled its numbers toward 1,400 and then beyond. They were moving without a supply train, living off what the country provided and what they had brought, moving fast because speed was their advantage. If Ferguson learned they were coming and retreated to the safety of Cornwallis's main army, the opportunity would be lost. Ferguson, for his part, was not entirely unaware that trouble was coming. He'd received intelligence that a Patriot force was organising to come after him, and he had begun moving eastward toward Cornwallis's main force at Charlotte, sending riders requesting reinforcement or support. But his movement was not as fast as it should have been, and his assessment of the threat, the number of men coming, the speed at which they were moving, the determination driving them, appears to have been significantly underestimated. He was still thinking in the categories of regular military operations, in which militia forces needed time to organise, to supply themselves, to coordinate their movements under unified command. The Overmountain Men did not operate on those timelines or within those limitations. On October 6th, the Patriot force received intelligence from a local Patriot woman. Accounts differ on her name and the precise circumstances, that Ferguson was camped on a rocky wooded ridge called Kings Mountain, just south of the North Carolina border in what is now York County, South Carolina. Ferguson had chosen the position deliberately, and by the tactical logic of his era it was a defensible one. Kings Mountain was not a mountain in any grand geological sense. It was a long, narrow, boat-shaped ridge rising perhaps 60 feet above the surrounding terrain, roughly 600 yards long and between 60 and 120 yards wide at its crest. It was rocky, covered with trees and boulders, with steep sides that would have to be climbed by any attacking force. Ferguson, assessing the position in the way he had been trained to assess military ground, found it strong. He reportedly said, with the confidence of a man who had spent his professional life thinking about such things, that God Almighty himself could not drive him from Kings Mountain. He was wrong. But understanding why requires understanding something about the particular nature of the men who were coming to test that claim, and about the particular kind of warfare that was about to be practiced on that wooded ridge. The Overmountain Men and their Carolina allies were not trained in the European style of linear infantry combat. They did not fight in close-ordered formations, shoulder to shoulder, advancing in disciplined lines to deliver massed musket volleys. That style of fighting, the style that had defeated the militia at Camden and that had made the British regular infantry so formidable on open ground, was foreign to them by training and by nature. What they were trained in, what they were extraordinarily good at, was a style of fighting that the 18th century called irregular or partisan warfare, and that the backcountry produced naturally: individual marksmanship, use of cover, advance through concealment, hunting-style movement through forested terrain. These were men who killed deer at 100 yards with regularity, for whom the long rifle was a tool as natural and familiar as a kitchen utensil, who moved through forested ground the way most European soldiers moved through open fields, with confidence, with skill, with an intimate understanding of how terrain could be used. The Kings Mountain, which Ferguson had chosen because it was high and difficult to assault from below in open formation, was in fact almost perfectly suited to the attacking style of the men who were coming to assault it. The trees and boulders that covered its slopes were not obstacles for the Overmountain riflemen. They were cover. The steep rocky ground that would have broken up a formal linear infantry advance became, in the hands of men accustomed to hunting in exactly this kind of terrain, a natural shooting gallery. Ferguson had chosen ground that was strong against the enemy he expected. He had not chosen ground that was strong against the enemy he was actually facing. The Patriot commanders rode through the night of October 6th and into the early hours of October 7th, and pushing their men to reach Kings Mountain before Ferguson could be warned and moved to safety. They arrived at the base of the ridge at approximately 3 p.m. on October 7th, 1780. It had taken extraordinary effort to get there. Men who'd been in the saddle for hours, who had been on the move for days, many of whom had not slept properly for 48 hours. But the intelligence was fresh, the position was confirmed, and the colonels made the decision without lengthy deliberation. They would attack immediately, encircling the ridge so that Ferguson's force had no avenue of retreat. The plan was straightforward almost to the point of simplicity, which was one of its greatest strengths. The Patriot colonels divided their force and sent each unit to approach the ridge from a different direction. Zeus William Campbell's Virginia riflemen on one side, Isaac Shelby's men on another, John Sevier's force on a third, Benjamin Cleveland's North Carolinians on a fourth. The encirclement was to be as complete as the terrain allowed, so that any movement Ferguson made to reinforce one point of his perimeter simply weakened another. There was no complex coordination of fire and manoeuvre, no synchronized timing that required men to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Each column was to advance to the base of the ridge when it was ready and begin climbing. Simple, flexible, and appropriate for the command and control limitations of militia forces that had been assembled rapidly from multiple different communities. Patrick Ferguson, on the crest of the ridge, had been watching the surrounding forest for signs of movement. He had posted pickets, but the Overmountain Men moved through the Carolina forest with a quietness that had been drilled into them by years of hunting, and the first real warning Ferguson had was when his pickets came running back into the perimeter, pursued by rifle fire, and the sound of sustained musketry erupted from the slopes below. What followed was unlike almost any other engagement of the Revolutionary War in the South. It was not a formal battle in any traditional sense. It was a siege fought on a vertical axis, attackers climbing upward through trees and boulders toward a crest that was occupied by defenders who had the advantage of high ground, but the critical disadvantage of being armed primarily with muskets and bayonets against opponents carrying long rifles and fighting from cover. The difference between a musket and a rifle in this context was not trivial. A musket was the standard military weapon of the 18th century, a smoothbore firearm that loaded relatively quickly and could be fitted with a bayonet. It was designed for mass, close-range linear warfare. Fire a volley at 50 yards, reload, fire again, advance with the bayonet. It was not an accurate weapon at distance. A rifle, by contrast, particularly the American long rifle, the so-called Kentucky rifle, though many of these were made in Pennsylvania, was a precision individual weapon. Its grooved barrel imparted spin to the ball, dramatically increasing accuracy at range. A skilled rifleman could hit a man-sized target at 200 yards or more with regularity. The trade-off was that rifles loaded more slowly than muskets, and making them less suitable for the rapid-fire linear tactics of formal battle. But in the terrain of Kings Mountain, where every attacker had a boulder or a tree trunk between himself and the defenders above, loading time was not the critical variable it would have been on open ground. Accuracy was, and the Overmountain Men had it in abundance. The Loyalist defenders on the crest had a real problem that Ferguson understood but could not fully solve. Their muskets, accurate to perhaps 50 yards under ideal conditions, were firing downhill at targets who were constantly moving, mostly concealed, often at ranges where the musket ball had already spent most of its effective force. The riflemen coming up the slope were firing uphill at targets who were visible against the sky whenever they stood to shoot or advance, as at ranges where the long rifle was still accurate. The geometry of the engagement favoured the attackers in ways that conventional military analysis of high ground did not predict, because conventional military analysis assumed roughly equivalent weapons on both sides. Ferguson tried everything. He led his men in bayonet charges down the slopes, the one weapon that could negate the rifleman's range advantage, because a man with a bayonet at close quarters was as dangerous as any rifle. The charges worked, briefly and locally. When the Loyalists swept down the slope with fixed bayonets, the riflemen below them gave ground, fell back down the ridge, took cover behind new trees and boulders, but the moment the bayonet charge stopped, and the Loyalists turned back up toward the crest, the riflemen followed them back up. And the shooting resumed. Ferguson could clear a section of the slope. He could not hold it cleared. He did not have enough men to be everywhere at once, and the attackers were coming from everywhere at once. The battle lasted approximately 65 minutes from first shot to the raising of the white flag, and within those 65 minutes it went through several distinct phases, each one tightening the noose around Ferguson's position a little further. In the early stages, the Loyalist bayonet charges were effective enough to create moments of real crisis for individual Patriot units. Shelby's men were pushed back twice. Campbell's Virginians gave ground under a determined charge down the northern slope. But each time a Patriot unit was pushed back, the pressure on other parts of the perimeter was temporarily relieved, which meant the other attacking units gained ground, which meant the perimeter of the crest shrank, which meant the Loyalists defending it had less room and fewer options. The dynamics of encirclement were working exactly as the Patriot colonels had hoped. Ferguson himself was everywhere. He was one of the most physically courageous combat commanders of the entire war, and on Kings Mountain he demonstrated that courage fully. He rode along his perimeter under fire, directing the bayonet charges, rallying men who were beginning to feel the weight of the multiple simultaneous pressures on the ridge's perimeter, using a silver whistle to signal his commands when his voice could not carry over the noise of sustained rifle fire. His horse was shot from under him during the battle. He mounted another. He was wounded. He kept riding. The men around him later said that he seemed to be trying to be in every part of the battle simultaneously, as though by sheer personal force of will he could compensate for the mathematical reality that his men were being pushed back from every direction at once. By late in the battle, perhaps 45 minutes after the first shots, the perimeter had contracted significantly. The attackers were within easy rifle range of the entire crest. The Loyalist force, which had begun the battle in a defensible position with reasonable options, was now essentially trapped on a shrinking plateau with no avenue of retreat and no relief coming. Ferguson understood this. He had two choices: surrender or attempt to break out by force, driving through one section of the encirclement with enough concentrated strength to punch a hole and escape, and he chose to attempt the breakout. Whether this was courage, desperation, professional pride, or simply the personality of a man who had never surrendered in his military career, probably all of these things together, he gathered a group of horsemen and drove toward the Patriot line on the southern end of the ridge. The charge was brave. It was also suicidal. The riflemen on the slopes had unobstructed fire at men on horseback moving at close range. Ferguson was hit multiple times. Accounts vary between 5 and 8 rifle balls, and his horse, carrying his dead or dying body, ran into the Patriot line before stopping. He fell from the saddle still tangled in his stirrup, and it was in that condition that his men found him when they went to retrieve his body after the battle. With Ferguson dead, the command of the Loyalist force devolved to his officers, and the situation they faced was clear. Surrounded, their commander dead, their casualties mounting by the minute, with no prospect of relief and no viable tactical option remaining. Captain Abraham de Peyster, the senior surviving officer, ordered the white flag raised. He used a white cloth, some accounts say it was a shirt, tied to a sword. The firing was supposed to stop. It did not stop immediately, and this is one of the hardest parts of the Kings Mountain story to tell honestly, because what happened in the minutes after the white flag went up was not a clean and orderly surrender, but a continuation of killing that became one of the most controversial episodes of the entire Southern campaign. Some of the Patriot riflemen, not all of them, were banned, but a significant number kept firing after the flag went up. The reasons were multiple and complicated. Some did not see the flag through the smoke and trees. Some had been told or believed that Tarleton's men had continued slaughtering Americans after Buford's force surrendered at the Waxhaws in May. Tarleton's quarter had entered the vocabulary of the backcountry as a term for treachery and murder under a flag of truce, and some of the men at Kings Mountain applied it in reverse, as justification for giving no quarter themselves. Some were simply unable, in the heat and adrenaline of sustained combat, to stop immediately when the signal was given. Some had personal grievances against specific Loyalist leaders on the ridge and were not inclined to let the technicality of a white flag protect them. The result was that Loyalist soldiers were killed after the flag was raised. Exact numbers are difficult to establish, but the evidence is clear that some men who had effectively surrendered were shot or killed in the confusion and fury of the battle's conclusion. The Patriot colonels worked hard to stop it. Campbell especially is recorded as riding among his men shouting at them to stop firing, that it was a disgrace to kill men who had surrendered, and they eventually succeeded. But the episode cannot be cleaned out of the historical record. An honest telling of Kings Mountain requires acknowledging it fully. The backcountry war was not a gentlemanly conflict. It was intimate, personal, and conducted by men who had genuine grievances and genuine hatreds on both sides. And those realities shaped how the battle ended as surely as they shaped how it began. The final count of casualties told its own brutal story. Of Ferguson's force of approximately 900 to 1,000 men, approximately 225 were killed, 163 wounded, and over 600 taken prisoner. Total Patriot casualties were approximately 90 killed and wounded. Remarkable numbers for an attacking force against an elevated defensive position, and a testament to the effectiveness of the riflemen's tactics. The entire action had taken little more than an hour from first contact to surrender. In the immediate aftermath, the Patriot force faced a practical problem that the battle's outcome had created. They had more prisoners than they had men to guard. They were in hostile country with British forces potentially within reach, and they had no established prison facilities or supply arrangements for several hundred captives. The march of the prisoners northward was harsh, made more harsh by the genuine anger of the Patriot militiamen who were serving as guards, by the food shortage that affected everyone, by the difficult terrain, and by the need for speed. Some prisoners died during the march from their wounds, from exposure, from the difficulty of the journey. 9 of the Loyalist prisoners were tried by a hastily assembled court-martial and hanged, an act that was legally questionable even by the standards of the time, and that added another layer of controversy to the battle's aftermath. But none of that complexity diminished the magnitude of what had been accomplished on October the 7th, 1780. Kings Mountain was, in every measurable military sense, a decisive victory of extraordinary proportions. Ferguson's force, the entire left wing of Cornwallis's western flank covering force, had ceased to exist. Every man in it was killed, wounded, or captured. The Loyalist militia network that Ferguson had spent months building in the Carolina backcountry was shattered. The line of communication and supply that had stretched from Cornwallis's main force westward into the backcountry was severed. And perhaps most importantly, the psychology of the backcountry, the sense of who was winning and who was losing, which side God and history were aligned with, shifted in ways that had immediate and profound practical consequences. Is Cornwallis's reaction to the news of Kings Mountain tells the story in compressed form. He was at Charlotte, North Carolina, preparing to push northward into Virginia, feeling that the Southern campaign was going according to plan. When the dispatches arrived describing Ferguson's destruction, he stopped. He pulled back. He retreated south to Winnsboro, South Carolina, abandoning the northward momentum he had worked months to build. His supply lines were threatened. His flank protection was gone. His intelligence about Patriot activity across the backcountry was suddenly unreliable. Kings Mountain did not end the Southern campaign by itself, but it ended the British momentum, gave the Patriot cause time to reconstitute itself under Nathanael Greene, and created the conditions in which everything that followed — cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, the race to the Dan, Yorktown — became possible. Thomas Jefferson, who was then the governor of Virginia and deeply concerned about the Southern campaign's trajectory, wrote in the weeks after Kings Mountain that it was a glorious victory, that it had given a decisive superiority to the American arms in the South. He was not wrong. The Continental Congress celebrated it. Washington received the news with relief that the accounts describe as visible and genuine. In London, the reports of Ferguson's defeat added to a growing sense that the Southern strategy was more difficult than it had appeared, that the American capacity for resistance was not broken, but merely driven underground, capable of re-emerging with sudden and devastating force when the conditions were right. But there is a layer to Kings Mountain that goes beyond military strategy and political consequence, and it is the layer that makes this battle genuinely unusual in the history of the Revolutionary War. It was fought entirely between Americans, and that fact raises questions about what the war actually was. Questions that the standard patriot narrative of a people rising up against British tyranny does not fully answer. The Loyalists at Kings Mountain were not mercenaries imported from Europe. They were not men who'd been pressed into service, or who were fighting for pay, or who had no connection to the land they were defending. Many of them had come to the Carolinas from the same Ulster and Scottish and English stock as the men attacking them. They had built farms, raised families, established communities. They believed, with the same conviction that drove the Overmountain Men over the mountains, that their cause was right, that the Crown offered stability, legal protection, the rule of established law, against what they experienced as the arbitrary coercion of Patriot committees that demanded oaths of loyalty, confiscated property from those who refused, and used militia force to compel compliance. Their experience of the revolution was not freedom versus tyranny. It was one form of coercion versus another, and they had chosen to align themselves with the form they found less threatening to their way of life. This does not make their cause morally equivalent to the Patriot cause in every dimension. The questions of representation, of constitutional principle, of the longer arc toward the democratic republic that the revolution ultimately produced, those questions matter, and the Patriot answers to them were better. But it does mean that the men who died on Kings Mountain for the Loyalist side were not villains or traitors in any simple sense. They were people who had made a different political choice in genuinely complicated circumstances, and they died for that choice on a rocky forested ridge in Carolina on an October afternoon in 1780. Ferguson himself deserves particular reflection. He was a remarkable man by any measure, talented, courageous, humane by the standards of his era, genuinely committed to winning the war in the South with as little unnecessary violence as possible. The irony of his fate is sharp and painful. The man who invented a superior rifle was killed by the riflemen who used inferior weapons better. The officer who refused to shoot an American general in the back at Brandywine died in a hail of American rifle fire at Kings Mountain. The commander who had worked hard to build a loyalist force capable of pacifying the backcountry was destroyed by the very backcountry culture he had failed to understand deeply enough. His grave is on Kings Mountain still. An iron rod marks the spot where his men buried him. The site is maintained by the National Park Service now, and people visit it regularly, not just to acknowledge a military casualty, but because the story of Patrick Ferguson carries its own kind of melancholy weight. The story of a gifted man destroyed by a strategic and psychological miscalculation that a single message, delivered through a paroled prisoner on a September afternoon, had set in motion. The Overmountain Men are meanwhile dispersed after Kings Mountain with the same practical immediacy with which they had assembled. They were not a standing army. They were farmers and hunters and community leaders who had come together for a specific purpose, accomplished it with devastating efficiency, and then needed to return to their communities before the winter made the mountain crossings impossible. They went back over the mountains, back to the Watauga and Nolichucky valleys, back to the families and farms and communities they had left when Ferguson's threat made action necessary. They took their victory with them quietly, without ceremony, in the way of men who had done what needed doing, and did not require an audience for the doing of it. John Sevier would become the first governor of Tennessee, or Isaac Shelby would become the first governor of Kentucky. William Campbell would die of illness before the war's end, his contribution to the victory at Kings Mountain representing the peak of a life cut short. Benjamin Cleveland would return to his North Carolina community and live another 25 years, a figure of local legend whose role at Kings Mountain was celebrated annually in the backcountry for generations after the war. These men were not, in the national memory, the giants of the Revolution. They did not have the visibility of Washington or Greene or Hamilton or Jefferson, but on October the 7th, 1780, they did something that those more famous figures could not have done. They assembled an army out of nothing, crossed mountains in October snow, found their enemy on a wooded ridge in Carolina, and destroyed him completely. Yet there is a particular quality of American military achievement that Kings Mountain represents, and it is worth naming it clearly: the capacity for spontaneous, rapid, effective military action by citizen soldiers who are motivated by direct and personal stakes in the outcome. The Overmountain Men had no military budget, no supply train, no government authorization, no chain of command linking them to the Continental Army or the Continental Congress. They came because one man threatened their homes, and they came to kill him for it. The efficiency with which they did so, the speed of their assembly, the quality of their march, the tactical effectiveness of their attack, was entirely a product of the culture and the conditions that the backcountry had produced over 2 generations. It could not have been replicated by the British Army, which operated within the constraints of professional military hierarchy and supply logistics. It could not have been replicated by the Continental Army, which was struggling simply to keep itself in the field. It was the specific product of a specific people in a specific place and time, and it changed the course of the war. The question that Kings Mountain forces us to think about, uncomfortable but necessary, is what it means that this decisive battle was won by men who were neither trained soldiers nor organized military units in any formal sense, who operated outside almost every structure that military theorists of the 18th century would have recognized as essential to effective military action. They had no artillery. They had no cavalry in any organized sense. They had no formal chain of command above the colonel level. They had no supply system beyond what they carried on their horses and what the country provided. They had no medical corps, no engineers, no commissary. What they had was rifles, horses, a shared sense of purpose, and leaders they trusted because those leaders had earned that trust through years of demonstrated competence in the environment they all shared. It is worth asking whether the lesson of Kings Mountain is primarily about military tactics, about the superiority of rifle-armed skirmishers attacking in cover over musket-armed defenders on high ground, or whether it is about something deeper, about the relationship between a community's values and its capacity for effective collective action, about what happens when people who genuinely believe that what they are fighting for is both right and necessary go up against an equally convinced but structurally different adversary. The British could produce Patrick Ferguson. They could not produce the Overmountain Men. The organisational structures and cultural values that made Ferguson possible could not produce spontaneous, self-organised, self-supplied, self-motivated citizen soldiers willing to cross mountains in October snow to kill the man who had threatened their families. That asymmetry, not of weapons or tactics, but of organisational culture and motivational structure, is, perhaps, the deepest lesson of Kings Mountain. And it is a lesson that has been revisited in one form or another in every counterinsurgency conflict that the history of the modern world has produced in the 2.5 centuries since that October afternoon in Carolina. The battlefield at Kings Mountain is still there. The National Park Service maintains it as a military park, and the landscape has changed less than you might expect. The ridge is still wooded, still rocky, still steep on its sides. Walking the trails around the crest, you can stand on the ground where Ferguson's men defended their perimeter, look down the slopes where the riflemen climbed, feel in the terrain the geometry of the engagement with a clarity that no map or description fully conveys. The trees are different, a second or third growth now, but the rocks are the same rocks, the ridge is the same ridge. People come to Kings Mountain steadily, in a quiet stream, mostly from the communities whose ancestors fought there. the descendants of the Overmountain Men celebrate an annual reenactment and march that retraces the original route over the mountains, a multi-day event that draws participants from the same communities, carrying rifles that would have been at home in 1780, sleeping under the same October sky that their ancestors slept under 2.5 centuries ago. There is something in that continuity, that willingness to physically remember, to put their bodies on the same ground their ancestors walked, that says something important about what Kings Mountain meant and continues to mean to the people of the Appalachian backcountry. For them it is not history in the sense of something distant and academic. It is family memory. It is the story of what their people did when it mattered. The Loyalist community has no equivalent tradition, which is itself a commentary on the cost of being on the losing side of a civil war. The descendants of the men who died defending the crest at Kings Mountain were in many cases driven from their communities after the war. Loyalists were dispossessed, exiled, stripped of their property across the Carolinas and Georgia in the years after Yorktown, and many of them ended up in Canada or the Bahamas or back in Britain, their American chapter closed by the defeat of their cause. Their story is harder to find in the historical record, not because it is less real, but because history is, in the end, written by the communities that persist, and the Loyalist community in the American South did not persist. It was scattered. To tell Kings Mountain honestly is to hold both of those realities simultaneously, the legitimate, genuine, impressive achievement of the Overmountain Men, and the equally genuine human cost paid by the men on the other side of the ridge, who were fighting for their own version of what was right. Both things are true, neither cancels the other. The complexity is not a problem to be resolved, but a reality to be acknowledged, because the complexity is the truth of what the Southern Campaign actually was. A civil war fought between Americans, with all the intimacy and passion and brutality that civil wars always carry. What Battlefield America exists to explore is exactly that kind of complexity, not the simplified mythology of the textbook version, and yet not the easy narrative in which the good guys win because they are good, and the bad guys lose because they are bad, but the actual human reality of the men who made these decisions, fought these battles, lived or died by the outcomes, and whose choices reverberate through the history of the country that came after them. Kings Mountain is one of the most important and least understood battles of the American Revolution, and it deserves to be understood in full, not just the tactical achievement and the strategic consequence, but the culture that made it possible, the people who paid its cost, and the questions about American identity and American violence and American community that it continues to raise for anyone willing to look at it clearly. You just spent time doing that. You came here, you stayed, and I swear. You engaged with a story that does not offer simple answers or clean heroics, but that offers something more valuable, a closer and more honest understanding of where this country came from and what it cost to build it. That is what this channel is for. Every battle we cover here has that kind of depth. Every campaign has those buried human layers that the standard history curricula never quite reach. Coming up on Battlefield America, we're going to go deeper into the Southern Campaign, to the partisan war that Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter and Elijah Clark waged in the swamps and forests and river crossings of the Carolina backcountry, a war of raid and counter-raid, ambush and reprisal that was as important to the final outcome as any formal battle. We're going to look at Guilford Courthouse, where Cornwallis technically held the field and practically destroyed his own army. We're going to look at the experience of the Loyalist civilians who were caught in the middle of a conflict they did not choose and paid a price they did not deserve. And we're going to keep looking for the stories that the standard history leaves out, the ones that deserve to be told, the ones that help us understand more fully what actually happened in the years that made the United States possible. If this episode gave you something, if you came away understanding Kings Mountain differently than you did when you started, then subscribe and hit the bell. The next episode is coming soon, and it is the kind of story that belongs on this channel and nowhere else. We will see you there.